is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the founder and publisher of Unwinnable.com. On the subject of tonight's topic, he told me that the book is definitely better than the movie, Stu Horvath.
Oh, jeez. The movie. I totally forgot about the movie. God, why'd you remind me? That's cold, man. Now I got to relive that.
Listen, in fairness, I've been reminded of a lot of songs, particularly recently, that I wish I could have forgotten again. And yet here we are. How you doing today, Stu?
I'm hanging in there. How are you?
Pretty good. So let's not be obtuse about the subject. What are we talking about tonight?
The Book of Vile Darkness. Ooh, spooky.
Gee.
But like in like metal voice, like spooky. Spooky. I'm almost done with the 90s, man, for the book. And there's sort of this unifying theme, like almost everything that came out in the 90s is real grim and gritty. Like everything, it's always raining in the 90s. Somebody's sad and angry. There's lots of violence.
Lots of pouches, pockets.
Yeah, lots of pouches. Yeah.
No feet.
But everything is just so like over the top kind of, it's like the pre-millennium tension, right? The millennium was coming, Y2K, the millennium TV show kind of primed us for something bad to happen.
Like Jenko's?
Exactly. The side of the apocalypse, right? It's right there in the Bible. All the games are like, there's a secret reality hidden underneath the reality that everyone thinks is real, and terrible things are afoot. Conspiracies are everywhere. And it's just this relentless pace. Literally every game is kind of like on that note. Like it's the end times, some great change is coming, and Cult is out there. So like, that's like the Clive Barker, the horror role-playing game. There's like Over the Edge is out there. That's like the William S. Burroughs role-playing game. So like all this mature content, right? Mature, like Toxic Avenger is mature, like English Patient is mature, you know?
Yeah. Mature as in like, you're definitely going to see some boobs and hear a lot of cussing in this one.
Yeah. R-rated doesn't necessarily mean, you know, it's for adults.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the 90s is when we had The Matrix in 99. Yeah. And it all, to me, changed after that point, because suddenly, like, you only had like one conspiracy theory friend in the group pre-Matrix, but then after that, forget it.
Yeah. Matrix is sort of the perfect example of like that idea that there's a more real out there, because you have like the actual Matrix, and that's all a lie. We're really like plugged into like, you know, some sort of battery, I guess is what they were.
Sure.
Anyway, so the interesting contrast to this is that TSR, because of the heat that they took in the 80s, TSR really tried to clean up its image in 1989 with the release of second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. You know, so they get rid of demons, they get rid of devils, they like anything that's questionable, they throw out. James Ward has this sort of infamous editorial in one of the Dragon magazines about not making moms mad. Like that's their mission statement. Like they can do whatever they want as long as the moms aren't going to get mad. And it creates this sort of boring undercurrent to D&D in the 90s. Like I loved second edition. That 90s is when I was really up to my neck in it. But you compare D&D second edition, which is like a little kid with, you know, spit curl and, you know, a bow tie. And then you have Vampire the Masquerade with all that Tim Bradstreet art, and like, you know, everybody's on the street smoking cigarettes and leather jackets. And it's interesting that the biggest role-playing game suddenly feels old, out of touch, dusty, creaky. And one of the best examples of this, I think, is Drizzt. I guess that's not how you pronounce it. It's Drizzt, right?
Just but anyway, feels right.
Yeah. You get all sorts of different visions of him in your head when you're reading the book, but like the paintings of him from, you know, the early 90s when he sort of makes his, I guess he debuted in the late 80s, like 89, but like he really kind of hits his stride in 90, 91, 92. 92 is when Drow the Underdark Sourcebook comes out. And that's when the Dark Elf trilogy is kind of rolling out the prequels, what, you know, how he leaves Menza Baranza. 93 is Menza Baranza box set. All of the visual treatment of Drizzt at that point is done by Jeff Easley. And he's got like this really big white flowing mane of hair. He's got like mutton chops. And he just kind of looks like an older dude, like kind of like a refugee out of ElfQuest, you know? Like there's something like 70s and weirdly old dude about him, which is
he had
weird.
Full on Engelbert Humperdinck side. No shit, like mutton chops for days.
Because of the market share, because of the amount of money that they pump into this, like he's still a huge marquee character. He's hugely popular. Everybody wants to play, you know, a dual wielding ranger, possibly a drow if they could, you know, beg, steal, and borrow the right dungeon master. But he looks like a grandpa. To contrast that with like Vampire the Masquerade, he just feels old, right?
Yeah, it certainly does, because with Vampire the Masquerade, everyone in those pages is like the cool kid that you know your mom is going to strongly disapprove you hanging out with.
Exactly. Those people know where to get drugs, even though they're vampires. They don't use them, but they know where to get them. It makes them sick. So I keep thinking about this, how like clean cut the 90s are. It changes towards the end of the 90s because, you know, TSR goes out of business. That old guard is swept away. A lot of people were angry about that clean cut image. And when Wizards of the Coast bought it and there began to be this realization that they were going to do a new edition, anecdotally, I don't know how true this was elsewhere, but I remember people being like, yeah, they're going to fix it. They're going to bring it back to the way it was, in that weird way that people get territorial about like a thing that they don't own.
You don't say.
Yeah, exactly. And they do, of course. Monty Cook is bringing back Demons and Devils by the end of second edition. You know, he does the Paladin in Hell, which is like a big middle finger to the old guard establishment that was kicked to the curb, because it's like a module that's all about all the stuff that got removed. But like the meta story is about bringing that stuff back into the meta narrative. Third edition comes out. In hindsight, I'm not sure that you could really say that third edition mechanically reflects that old school first edition. It's really complicated.
It really is, and unnecessarily so.
Yeah, you have to have like a lot of books. I remember carting around a lot of books, Hambo.
Well, I mean, it was so complicated that they had to be like, wait a second, here's 3.5. We fixed it for you, because, you know, back then you could have just like, oh, but hit a button and upload some new rules here. It's just, well, you got to buy another book, which, you know, of course works in their favor, but nonetheless, you're carrying books.
Yeah, 3 releases and it's kind of broken. That's why there is a 3.5. They blew it, but people were very forgiving. And one of the last actual 3.0 books that came out was the Book of Vile Darkness. This is all sort of prelude, but I feel like Book of Vile Darkness is D&D's I missed out on the 90s, let's get edgy book.
Oh, yeah. They definitely went for it fully and all in. The Book of Vile Darkness is one of those books that, like, my younger cousin, when he got into D&D, now I'm 42 years old. So at this point, I think he's got to be like 23. So I remember when he was like 19, 20, he hits me up, and, you know, I hadn't heard from him in a little while because, he is 19. He's living his life. But he would always like hit me up and ask me like random like questions about D&D. And so one day he's like, yo, Johnny, have you ever seen or heard of the Book of Vile Darkness? And I was like, yeah. He's like, do you know where I can get a copy? And to me, it was like that thing where, like, you know, you've got the cool younger cousin who's trying to be cooler, and he's like kind of hoping you leave like some Playboys lying around the apartment, or maybe you're going to like give him a beer, but don't tell mom kind of thing. And it was just like, dude, one, I have no idea where to even find the Book of Vile Darkness. And on eBay at that time, it was like a couple $100.
Jeez, really?
Oh, it was expensive at that point. And the other thing was just like, man, I don't know. I also felt like the older person who had responsibility not to like share this like filth with this child who's like, I mean, it's like 19. It's fine. It's like whatever. But nonetheless, it was definitely like that weird, like, wow, I'm older now and this is a moral conundrum.
Yeah, I mean, right there on the cover, it says warning. There's a sticker that says warning, content is intended for mature audiences only. So I don't know. How mature is your cousin?
Yeah, it could go either way. He's cool, man. You know, all kidding aside, like the kid is fantastic. He's not a kid anymore. He's like 23 at this point, but you know what I mean? He's younger than I. And I felt it was weird. Like, I don't know if his mom's going to like want me to give this to him, because like, then like, what if like he leaves it out one day and his mom is like, what is this filth that you're reading? And I don't know. I just didn't want that kind of heat being brought down on me. Fantasy booking this whole thing through, it just felt like a bad idea.
And rightly so. I feel like Book of Vile Darkness goes too far. It's one of the few 2.0 books that I kept that I still have, because I do have a fondness for it. But I do feel like it's definitely overcompensating in a lot of ways, because lines are crossed that I'm just like, ooh, why would you want to put that in a role-playing game? It's skeevy, you know?
The way it was described to me when I was first playing D&D, it was like, wow, Hambone, do you like Clive Barker? And I was like, I don't know. I mean, I watched the Hellraiser movies. They're like, well, just imagine Clive Barker wrote an RPG with wizards' money. And that's the Book of Vile Darkness. And I was like, okay, I don't know how I feel about that, but sure, cool.
So Monty Cook is behind it. He wrote the whole thing, and it's filled with lots of great ideas, because that's what he's really good at, is just like stoking your brain in ways that make you want to play with his ideas. And, you know, it brings back demons and devils. Yeah, I think it comes from a philosophical place that evil is evil and it should be repellent when it's portrayed. And I appreciate that in theory, but in execution, I feel like that's not what D&D is really about. Even if you think that's the way it should be, I feel like D&D plays best when your villains have mustaches that they twirl. They're not looking to like have sex with your corpse. And that's like a lot of the tone of Book of Vile Darkness, is that there's lots of cod pieces. There's probably some inappropriate father-daughter behavior between one of the Lords of Hell. It's
So Monica is a genius game designer, like brilliant in every way. And you're right. The way that Monica creates kind of challenges your ideas of the way things should be, and kind of makes you think about things differently. Like you read some of the stuff and you could like see the Rubik's Cube turning. And I think that's incredible. And I agree with you where it's like in D&D, it's kind of like off-putting in a way, because a lot of people out there will say, well, this is not what D&D is, and this is what D&D is not about, and this, that, and the other thing. And to the validity and the lack of validity of many of those arguments, sure, whatever. But this was definitely like, oh, we are going to invite the weird cousin down for Thanksgiving and just not say anything about it. And we're just going to see what happens. And that was kind of the reaction I know from around the time when like people were kind of like, you know, passing it around. It was just like one of those things where like if someone found your fantasy book, they'd be like, oh, he's into nerd shit. But if they found the Book of Vile Darkness, they're going to be like, oh, he's into something else.
It's the same as death metal, man. Death metal, and to a lesser extent black metal, but Book of Vile Darkness has a lot in common with death metal, where it's all about gore and gross and transgressing in that way. I'm looking at a picture. It's one of the monsters. It's called a Slaughter King. It's like got 6 arms. It looks like a giant kind of slash between something out of the Doom video game and Alien. And it's got like a dude that it pulled in half and is playing with his intestines. You know, it's like a Cannibal Corpse record, you know?
See, I liken it more to like Mayhem opening up for Metallica, but when Metallica started slowing down and playing with like, you know, putting fire on all their guitars and like doing the 3/4 rock stands and just keeping the songs under 4 minutes.
Yeah.
It's a very stark contrast when you think of it like that.
And like I said, there's a lot of good ideas. And this is sort of an interesting thing. You know, I'm neither here nor there on it, but it kind of undoes the idea that D&D is a power fantasy for the players, and really kind of puts power back in the hands of the DM if they want to build a villain that uses the Book of Vile Darkness sort of rules. There's all sorts of different classes and really messed up spells. And like you could make a character that could take on and really decimate like a really powerful party of PCs and make them feel like dirty about it, you know? And I think that's interesting, but I think that's also like gonna like make everybody in here not want to play anymore, you know? Like part of role-playing game is about keeping the game going. And Book of Vile Darkness is an adversarial tone that feels like it goes too far and doesn't feel fun anymore.
And that's the point, right? You want to have fun with your friends. Like the thing I enjoyed about it was I likened it back to those magic books that you had for, I want to say it was 2nd edition. They were like faux leather bound and they came in 4 different colors. And it was
the Encyclopedia of Magic Items.
Yeah, amazing.
Yes.
Spells, magic items, all that stuff like that kind of felt cool to me, kind of as an accessory to a game, because it's like, oh, this is like an actual thing. Like it's not just something that is like wedged inside of a Dungeon Master's guide. Like this is like something that looks cool on my bookshelf as well. And I like that you actually have something that could be considered an in-game tool and item that you're using in the real world. And that's one of the things I did appreciate about the Book of Wild Darkness, is that it's a similar thing where it is something that is an in-game thing, that is an item that is also a real world tool. I found that to be kind of clever and kind of interesting. And that's one of the things that I was kind of appreciated about D&D. So at that point, like, yeah, that's awesome. And that being said, I agree with you as well, where it becomes a thing where it's like, how cool can something be if it actually turns people off to playing?
Yeah. I think that the idea behind Book of Wild Darkness was to give everybody who ever complained about the appropriateness of Dungeons and Dragons something to actually complain about. And while I appreciate that sentiment, because I get that, like I've worked very hard to repress that reflex, but I understand it. I do think that it's counterproductive. I think that like having this laying around, it just confirmed a lot of fears for people, and it just turned them off from the hobby forever. And like, that's not cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard when the thing that you are hoping is kind of like the rallying cry to say, hey, we are not these out of touch dudes anymore. You know, come with us. It's going to be a party. It's kind of the thing that also becomes sort of like out of touch and disjointed from what the actual idea of Dungeons and Dragons is all about.
Yeah. Third edition is just like, we're going to bring it back. We're going to have a party. It's going to be awesome. Bring your friends. Let's go. And then Book of Wild Darkness is like, yeah. And we're going into a Hostel movie. Like, and it's just like, what? This isn't the party that I thought I was going to, bro.
Yeah.
I love transgressive art. I love extreme metal. I love messed up horror movies and stuff like that, but there's a place for it. I think that like, even like a role-playing game like Cult, which is like built from the ground up to be the transgressive role-playing game. It's explicitly based on the vibe of Clive Barker's literary work. That's fine, because like it signposts it going in. Book of Wild Darkness is the only book in the entire Dungeons and Dragons catalog that's like that. It's a landmine waiting for somebody to step on it, because like the rest of Dungeons and Dragons isn't configured like that.
Yeah, it's definitely the cousin that you bring to a party that you have to call the next day to a bunch of people and apologize for. You know, where you're like, he's actually really cool, but like, you know,
he just gets wound up sometimes, you know?
Yeah. So, I mean, with that, you know, what I want to ask you is, this appears to be a one and done kind of thing for them, right? Like, they went into this with a certain idea, and then the response they got was obviously not what they were expecting.
I do think that they kind of knew what they were getting themselves into, but then anytime you do something like this, you open a door. And one of the things that comes out of 3.0 is, you know, the open gaming license, the D20 system, all of that stuff. So you have a whole bunch of outside companies making stuff that's compatible with your system and under your D20 system logo. So you're associated with all those products by extension. And when the Book of Erotic Fantasy came out in the next year, 2003, you know, we make fun of that book, you know, because it's like, who wants to play that D&D, right? It's not extreme like Book of Wild Darkness, but it's stuff that is in the mature category, and it seems like a strange fit for Dungeons and Dragons, right? And Wizards sort of gets bent out of shape. They don't outright censor it, but they immediately introduce community standards of decency for the D20 system. And like, that's hypocritical, man. Like, you put out Book of Wild Darkness and you can't have the sex book.
I mean, I'm just thinking right now, like, that is definitely not going to age well. But even back then, like, you know, it probably was well-intentioned, maybe, but there's no way the execution was going to like help them, you know, stick the dismount, because holy crap.
Not. Like, it's totally a crap book. Once you do Book of Wild Darkness, I feel like you lose a lot of the high ground on it to be like, no, you can't do the Book of Erotic Fantasy. Like, seriously? You did the Book of Wild Darkness.
It doesn't age well, because, you know, now we know what Wizards is up to, and they're all like, yeah, we're family friendly. We're doing this. We want everyone to play. And so something like this would not even remotely exist in the world that D&D is now, which for all intents and purposes, as far as the IP of Dungeons and Dragons goes, this is where I feel that something like the Book of Wild Darkness kind of rubs completely wrong, because this is essentially what they were intending at that point then, with like, what is D&D? Well, this is what the idea of D&D is, but you could still get away with doing things like the book in Vile Darkness and that weird, like creepy, like sex book that you just mentioned. But now it's like clearly like laid out from a very high corporate level. Like, this is D&D, and I'm making like a little box in the air with my fingers, everybody. And so like, I appreciate the Book of Vile Darkness, and maybe not so much that weird sex book that you just mentioned, but, you know, I appreciate the sentiment of it because there was still that kind of like, this is like the last of the Wild West that was Dungeons and Dragons as a role-playing game, as an entity. And I mean, listen, some would say, you know, how could you, you know, really expect anything more when they made a cartoon of the thing? It was obviously getting neutered at that point, but, you know, I think that the Book of Vile Darkness kind of becomes an overcorrection for that neutering.
And like, that's the thing. Like, it was always a kid's game. It was always targeted for children after the 70s. Once we got out of like the true Wild West was 6 years. And by the end of that 6 years, like, it was really taking a family friendly turn already, because that's where the money was at. That's why there's basic sets, because, you know, kids needed like training wheels to get into the hobby. Everybody who's always sort of like, oh yeah, man, like stuff was harder, man. Like, it was cooler. It was demons and boobs. And it's just like, yeah, but like, that wasn't like, like, it was never really as hardcore as you think it was. Like, you made it that way, and that's how you played it, and you had fun, and that's cool, because D&D is what you make it. But your D&D isn't everybody else's D&D, and that's something that kind of gets lost, I think, especially when you look at a book like Book of Vile Darkness. It's like, that's not everybody's cup of tea.
You know, I do hear a lot of commentary like that from people, and I get it, because I also look back at it the same way that I look at the Attitude Era of WWF wrestling, which is, you know, we all like to think things were better back then, but when you watch it back now, you're like, okay, so I remember like this, and this, but wow, the rest of it was crap and really boring and really not that entertaining. Like, you know, we hyper focus on those moments that made things great and made us feel great. And those things are the things that pop up in all the clip shows, and those things are the things that pop up in GIFs, and those things are things that pop up on t-shirts and stories that you talk about and tell your friends. And that's awesome. But what about like the thousands and thousands and literal thousands of other hours where you were like, oh man, I definitely probably went and took a pee during that match or something like that. And that is a lot of the gaming experience that comes at these tables. Like, we still talk about things that happened in your game over 12 years, but man, there was a lot of other things that happened in that game that lasted for so long that we just don't remember.
Yeah. And like, are edited out because like, yeah, it wasn't that good or whatever. Or like, I was sick that night.
Or you forgot to bring the necessary book out of the 19 other books that you brought. Your poor back.
Yeah. But that's how nostalgia works, right? Like, you single out the good thing and then you like turn it into something that it never was to begin with. What it was like one bright moment that justifies all the other fun moments that aren't as bright. But like, when you apply that nostalgia lens to it, it becomes something different, something kind of like rarefied, but also not real, because you can't really remember the thing outside of its context. It's a part of its time.
Do you have any final thoughts on the Book of Vile Darkness?
Oh man, if it's worth a lot of money, I might have to sell it.
I don't know. Why don't you go see our friends over at Noble Night Games and see what they'd give you for it? They have an exceptional trade-in program, and that's a plug, folks, from your old buddy HB to our friends at Noble Night Games.
Yeah, no, I think that my real last takeaway is that like, it's an interesting book. Like, if you want to check out a PDF, that's cool, but like, don't leave that thing laying around. Put it on a high shelf out of the way of the kids.
Very cool and very true, Stu. So this is another awesome episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. Stu, where can the people find you?
Oh, they can find me over on Instagram at Vintage RPG, posting stuff. Hey, you know, actually, the Book of Vile Darkness is already up on the feed, so I don't know. I don't think I'll ever post anything quite so nasty again.
You can find me on the Twitter and on Instagram at John McGuire RPG. I tweet and post some things sometimes. You could also check out our Patreon, patreon.com/vintagerpg. We've got a great behind the scenes look at Stu's book. We've got a behind the scenes look at my RPG 321 action. We've got a killer Discord community that we'd love for you to be a part of. Early release episodes as well, patreon.com/vintagerpg. And if you like the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe, because your reviews really do help other listeners to find us. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.